This is Edward James Olmos, a Mexican-American actor who first gained prominence in the 80s for his roles in Blade Runner, Miami Vice, and Stand and Deliver, with the last one earning him an Oscar nomination. Unfortunately for Edward, he decided to follow up that Oscar-nominated performance by producing, directing, and starring in a mediocre mafia movie that got 10 people murdered. The movie I'm talking about is called American Me. It follows the story of Montoyo Santana, a member of the Mexican Mafia who is loosely based on the real-life mafia boss Rodolfo Cheyenne Cadena. Now, despite what the name might lead you to believe, the Mexican Mafia is in fact not Mexican. I guess it's a bit like French fries and Swedish fish, in the sense that all three of them are not Mexican. The organization is entirely based out of the California prison system. It was founded in the 50s to unite Hispanic prisoners, and it expanded in the 60s under the leadership of Cheyenne Cadena. And Edward James Olmos decided he liked the life story of Cheyenne so much that he was going to make it his directorial debut. So he bought the rights to a screenplay about the mafia boss and got to work on this dream project of his. But I guess Edward wasn't completely satisfied with Cheyenne's life, so he began seriously altering the script. That's an old trick of the trade when you're making a biopic. Change the person's entire life in several fundamental ways. Now, it probably wouldn't have been a big deal if he was only changing small things, like giving the guy a pet dog or something. But Edward James Olmos made two huge changes. The first was having the main character get raped in prison. Yep, he actually added that even though it never happened in real life. A prison warden who knew Cheyenne and was a consultant on the original script reportedly asked Edward James Olmos why he decided to add that, to which Olmos replied that it was kind of a philosophical thing to show the kids what could happen. I don't really know what's philosophical about a man getting raped in prison, but I'm glad the scene was educating our youth. It does make you wonder how appealing the movie made life in prison seem if he needed to add that to convince the kids that it wasn't a fun time. The film was also rated R, but I guess Edward knew that kids would be sneaking in by the thousands to go see the prison rape movie. The second thing that he changed was the way that the main character dies. In real life, Cheyenne Cadena was attempting to negotiate an alliance with the Mexican Mafia's biggest enemy, but the members of that rival gang stabbed him to death. And somehow that extremely cinematic story still wasn't good enough for Edward James Olmos, who changed the death so that Cheyenne was instead stabbed by his own men, who were upset about his efforts to make peace. In other words, he took a story about the hero of the Mexican Mafia and made it so that the people who still loved him dearly in real life were the ones who killed him in the movie. That's like someone giving you a photo book of your family, but one of the pictures is you stabbing your grandmother to death. While the movie was being developed, Edward James Olmos met with the actor Danny Trejo, who was a drug dealer in his youth but turned his life around after spending 5 years in the California prison system. So you'd think Danny Trejo would be someone you'd really trust if you were making a movie like this. But when the two of them got lunch together and Danny begged Edward not to make the movie, old EJO refused to listen. Not only that, he showed up to the lunch essentially in character. In his autobiography, Danny Trejo wrote, "I turned around and saw Edward in full cholo wear. He was in a county blue shirt buttoned up at the top and flying open on the bottom. He wore county blue pants. The only thing he was missing was a hairnet. This was a business meeting." Danny asked Edward if he had gotten permission to make this film from the de facto kingpin of the Mexican Mafia, a man named Joe Pegleg Morgan. And if that sounds like the whitest name for a Hispanic gangster you've ever heard, then you might have a future in racial profiling, because he was indeed a white guy who had risen through the ranks of the Mexican Mafia by being Cheyenne's right-hand man. And yes, he did have a prosthetic leg, if you're wondering where the nickname came from. Edward James Olmos claimed that he had met with Pegleg and gotten his personal approval on the entire script. But the next day, Joe Pegleg Morgan actually called Danny Trejo from prison, essentially warning him about getting involved with American Me since the script was full of bullshit. Pegleg said that he had refused to meet with Edward and that, quote, "there's going to be a lot of problems with that movie." And he wasn't talking about the fact that it would get a tepid 66 out of 100 on Metacritic. So at this point, Danny Trejo was put in a situation where he essentially had to negotiate for the lives of the people involved with the movie. Joe assured him that the innocent actors and crew members would be fine. But he didn't say anything about Edward James Olmos and all the real-life gangsters who had participated in the film. And after the movie came out, things went about as well as expected. Any gangsters who had been involved in the film, whether as consultants or actors, immediately became targets of the Mexican Mafia. What resulted was essentially the Latino version of the murder sequence at the end of The Godfather. One guy who played someone buying weed in the film was gunned down in his apartment 12 days after the movie came out. Another guy who was only sitting in his car in the background of a scene was shot 7 times. The film's top consultant was a woman named Ana Lizarraga, who had been warned about getting involved with the project and also lied about getting approval from Joe Morgan. She was executed in her driveway in front of her son. It's uncertain exactly how many people were murdered for their involvement with the film, but Danny Trejo says the number is around 10 people killed, both inside and outside prison. All this for a movie that didn't even make back its budget at the box office. It probably didn't help that it opened on the same day as My Cousin Vinny, a movie which cost $5 million less and made $51 million more. I guess the kids of America will never know what could happen if they joined a prison gang. Once the film was released and people started getting murdered, Edward James Olmos realized what a huge mistake he had made. A year after the movie came out, the LA Times put out an article revealing that Edward was haunted by the film, having spent a year living in extreme paranoia that he was going to get killed. A few months after the film's release, Edward received a letter from a Mexican Mafia member in prison, wishing him, quote, health, happiness, and box office success. And even someone as oblivious as Edward was able to figure out the threat there. He even applied for a concealed carry permit, because I'm sure the gangsters sent to kill him would have first given him the opportunity to defend himself in a duel. The article didn't make it seem like Edward James Olmos was too broken up about having directly caused the death of 10 people, but I'm sure he was just busy preparing for a film in which his character burns a picture of the Prophet Muhammad. Obviously, Edward James Olmos did not die, as he's still alive today. But years later, it was revealed that Joe Pegleg Morgan had attempted to extort him, seemingly getting Edward to pay him to not be murdered. Pegleg also filed a lawsuit against Edward, seeking at least $500,000 for what he claimed was an inaccurate portrayal of him in the movie. But they didn't have his character get raped, so I can't imagine he had it worse than Cheyenne. Thankfully for Edward James Olmos, Joe Morgan died of cancer in late 1993, and it seems the rest of the Mexican Mafia just kind of moved on, probably when they realized that nobody saw the movie anyway. Or maybe he was never in any real danger, and all those killings were kind of a philosophical thing to show Edward what could happen. Now please consider subscribing, or Edward James Olmos will make a movie about your life story.